Hello audience, this is a General Motors 3800 V6 Series 2 or Buick 3800 V6 Series 2, whatever you want to call it, and we're going to try to rebuild it. Now this one was used originally in a 2002 Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS, and the problems it has are it's been overheated a lot. It's got some really bad cooling issues. It likes to overheat a lot, so we're going to try and figure out what that is. Also, it's got some knocking or clanking going on. It's got a few weak cylinders, possibly a few dead cylinders. So I'm not sure how much of this actually can be saved or what. So we'll just have to take it apart and see what we have. So if you're installing an engine onto an engine stand, one thing you should do is get bolts that are the proper grade, proper length, and proper thread size for the job. What you should really never do is use old Model A head studs, especially with imperial threads on a metric engine. First of all, as you can see, I've already removed the plenum, the intake manifold, and the exhaust to make it easier to get out of the car. So we'll start going after the cylinder heads. Okay, time to pull the head off. It's probably going to get really dirty really fast. Now, one thing I should point out is these push rods, if you plan on reusing them, and the rocker arms, you should not mix them up. You should remember what cylinder and what valve they go with. I'm going to try to remove this without them flying everywhere. What I really should have done is remove the rocker arms and then pull the studs out individually, but I'm a little too lazy to do that. So here we go. It would help to remove all the bolts. Okay. Okay, so we're removing the crankshaft pulley, and it doesn't exactly come off by hand like it did on the Classic, so we're using a puller. Now this has 3 rectangle holes on the pulley, and behind them there's threaded holes that the bolts are screwed to. I have no idea what thread size they are, so sorry, I can't tell you. Now, as a stop for the puller, I'm using the original pulley bolt. The thing is, it needs to be loosened up to allow the pulley to move forward. I've already cracked it loose, so I'm just turning it a little bit to give it more room. And I'll pull on it a little more. I've already pulled it pretty far. Just need a little more to get it off. Now if you're wondering, no, this is not entirely the proper way to do it. It's also got some rings in it for the crankshaft sensor, so that's important. So next, the water pump. Well, look at that. This thing has like no blades left on the impeller. They're like completely rusted off. Bearing's still good though. So I think we found our problem, or at least one problem. This thing had no water pump. It was thermal siphon cooling like a Model T. Oh, I'm kind of impressed actually at how good it was working. Now I'll go after the timing cover. It has a bunch of bolts here and appears to have 3 bolts underneath from the oil pan. Crankshaft sensor. Some of these bolts have a really small head and they're torqued way down and they like to round off, so it's best if you can use something with a wrench or a socket that's 6-point instead of 12-point, because they round off really easy with a 12-point. So I got the oil pan off. Another interesting thing is the oil pan gasket is also the windage tray. So that's kind of bizarre. And looking inside, it looks fairly clean. And if you're wondering why I haven't flipped the engine over yet, this is why. It's because I already drained the oil out of it and it still had this much in it. So if you flip the engine over, all this will come out the top. Another thing to notice is the piston to cylinder wall clearance. Now, I'm not using any precision tools to check this, but I think we can safely assume that's pretty loose. And they're all pretty much that way. Oh, that one's even more. That's probably where the clanking noise is coming from. Also, before we take the pistons and rods out, it's important to mark and keep track of which piston goes in which bore. Also, which way is forward. Now looking at it from underneath, so you can see the strainer has picked up a little bit of contamination, but not much. It looks pretty clean overall. One interesting thing I've discovered here is you can see the rod journals are offset from each bank. In other words, the number 2 connecting rod journal is slightly more advanced in rotation than the number 1 journal. Which is kind of interesting, and all of the journals are that way, all the rod journals. I heard of this in college. They told us that a V8 engine at this, with the banks at this angle, the cylinders counterbalance each other naturally, and that doesn't really work with a V6 because there's 2 less cylinders, so the way they countered it is to offset the throws. So I guess that's what this is for. Either way, it's kind of interesting. Okay, that was interesting. Normally you gotta tap these out with a hammer and a block, but this one, the piston was so loose I just pushed it out. Now the bearings, I've got some noticeable wear to them. I don't know if they're usable or not. We'll worry about that later. Crankshaft journal looks pretty good. It's not scraped or anything too badly. Now, I also like to point out that it's very important when you're taking these apart not to mix up the rod caps with the rods. they're machined together with each rod and they only go one direction. You put them on the other direction, it won't be perfectly round anymore. So it's very critical to even mark it if you have to, but make sure they always go back together in the exact same way they came apart in. The piston looks okay. Another thing is, like the Ecotech, it appears to have full floating wrist pins. In other words, it's got a little snap ring in there that you can remove and then slide the pin out, hopefully, as opposed to like a small block Chevy where they're pressed in. There we go. Okay. For the tensioner, that's got a pretty deep groove in it. Might just be from normal wear, I don't know. Now the book recommends replacing the timing chain if it has an inch or more of slack in it. It didn't really tell me how to measure for slack, so I'm just kind of guessing. Okay, we're wiggling it back and forth. It's got exactly an inch of play. So, yeah, I may as well replace it anyway. They're cheap. There we go. Here's the timing gear. I'd like to point out that this has a magnet on it right here, and that's for the camshaft sensor. Now, it is a actual conventional magnet. So, if the cam sensor is not working properly, this can be an issue if the magnet falls off or something. And the magnet snaps in from the back, so you have to remove the timing gear to get it to replace it. And the drive gear for the balance shaft, which once you get the bolt off, it's loose. I've noticed that this has timing marks on it, so keep that in mind putting it back together. And according to the book, remove these two fasteners and the thrust plate comes off and the whole camshaft should come off. But before that, we got to remove the lifters and find a place for them. So either going to do that next or remove the crankshaft. We'll see. Right, I decided to remove the lifters and then the cam first. So first thing I need to do is remove these plates that hold the lifters in. There we go. So you can see the holes for the lifters, they have flat spots on them to keep the lifters from spinning because it has roller lifters. As you can see, it has a little wheel on it. Now, it is very important that we do not mix up the lifters, because if we reuse them, we have to match the exact lifter with the lobe on the cam that it was in, because they've already seated together. And since this is a roller lifter assembly, we have to make sure that we remember what direction they go, because we put them in backwards, that will upset the wear pattern. So what I'm doing is, as I remove them, I'm just putting them in the holder exactly the way they were. Now, one would argue this is probably not the most sophisticated way of keeping track of parts, but it will work. I'm just going to mark what side of the bank they were on, R for right, and then mark which direction is front. That should give us all the data we need to put it back together. There's the camshaft. The manual reads that to remove the balance shaft, the bearings have to be pressed out. Not sure what kind of bearings they are, but I'm afraid that will destroy them and they'll have to be replaced. And there's nothing wrong with the balance shaft anyway, so I'm just going to leave it. Now, before we can remove the crankshaft, we have to remove the rear main seal, which is one piece and it's on a really big plate on the back of the block. So I'm going to try to do all that without taking it off the engine stand. I don't know if I'll be able to. Starting with taking the flex plate off. I think the engine is externally balanced. In other words, there's offset weights on the crank pulley and on the flex plate. As you can see, it's got these three big holes here, but nothing on the opposite side. So when I put it back together, it's important that it goes exactly where it was. I don't know if there's a keyway or a pin or something to hold it in that position, so I'm going to mark it before I take it apart. So I got the caps off, removed the crankshaft. Main bearings still look pretty good. I think we can reuse them. Now, one thing I forgot to say earlier is the main bearing caps, like the rod caps, they should be marked what direction they go and where they went. Luckily, these newer engines, many of them are marked from the factory, like this one. Marked 1 with an arrow pointing forward, so it's the front one. Now, another interesting thing about this engine is it has bolts that go in from the bottom and from the side, and these caps are probably, you'd technically call it an interference fit. They fit very tight on the block. As you can see, that one won't even go on. These were quite a hassle to remove. Now, the book recommends when installing these to get the bolts caught and then tap the bearing cap down with a hammer. That sounded really strange to me until I discovered this. So that's as far as I'm going to go for now. I need to look everything over more closely and see what to replace, what to save, or if I'm even going to finish this. But if I do, you'll see that in a future video. So, thank you for watching. Like, dislike, subscribe, comment, whatever. And I'll see you in the next video.